Hi there, Steve Kaufman here again, and today I want to talk about what I would call false debates in the realm of language learning or language acquisition. What I mean by false debates, I would say that in my now 10 years or so that I've been involved with the whole online language learning community, it seems to me that there are two major sort of points of contention. One is whether we should speak early or whether we should speak, later. In other words, whether we should focus on output or whether we should focus on input. So that's one debate. And the other debate is whether we need grammar or don't need grammar in order to learn a language. Okay, why I consider these in a way false debates is because in both cases, it's not a black and white situation, all right? Input versus output. Of course, at some point, you have to start outputting. People learn languages in order to output. They want to speak. They want to communicate. So those people who focus on input, in most cases, it's not because they don't want to output. It's because they feel more comfortable building up competence in the language, vocabulary, comprehension before they start speaking. And that is a personal decision. There could be some who simply want to learn the language in order to read books or understand movies so that they would be totally passive. But that's not likely to be the case. I think there's very few people like that. Maybe researchers or something like that. Most people, and most people who do put a lot of effort into input and comprehend the language spoken and when they read, they develop the ability to speak. However, people who want to speak early, who have an urge to speak, who want to communicate even poorly with whatever words they have and they're struggling to understand, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And those people necessarily have to invest time in input activities. Even while they're speaking, they're listening, they're gaining something through input. So fundamentally, there's no contradiction with those two positions. It's simply a matter of what you prefer to do. So to that extent, it's not a real debate. Just do what you want to do. Some people say, yes, but people wait too long and they become afraid to speak. I would think that a person who's afraid to speak when they have very little understanding of the language could in fact become less afraid if they build up more confidence in their ability in the language. So it really again comes down to personal preference, making sure you spend time with the language. Now, the other big debate is the grammar versus input. Now, I have said before, and in my previous video, I said there are things that I simply don't notice in a new language, and that it helps sometimes to have this pointed out, say, in a grammar explanation. However, it's only after I've experienced this several times that I even understand this explanation. And if I'm confronted with the task of trying to remember when I use this tense as opposed to that tense, it's intimidating. And if the task of learning a language is presented to me as having to remember this rule and the exceptions, I find that puts me off. Now, there are people who love that. Typically people who have a lot of experience with languages and they feel they can kind of shortcut and get to the essence. Aha, this language is subject, verb, object, and this other language is subject, object, verb or something. I have personally never found that useful. When I went to learn Japanese, it became immediately obvious to me that the verb comes at the end. So I didn't need to see a theoretical explanation that that is the word order. But I can see that it's possible some people find that confusing. So a quick reference to an explanation like that can be helpful. And there are sometimes things that we simply don't notice without an explanation. So again, a mixture of some degree of involvement with grammar to the degree that we want to be involved with grammar, again a matter of personal preference, and then exposing yourself to as much of the content as possible, finding things of interest, beginning perhaps with simpler material like our mini stories and ramping up to where you can expose yourself to a lot of audio and reading in the language, regularly referring back to grammar issues when you have a problem. And I find I do this. I'll look up the declension of a Russian noun or look up the conjugation of a Spanish verb when I'm interested, and then it sort of solves a problem that I'm experiencing in the text. Typically, again, if I'm trying to tag this phrase for something. Now, bear in mind that I can't spend all of my reading time tagging and doing all of this sort of careful mining of the text. I also want to get that general exposure. So you kind of combine some degree of worrying about the details and the nuts and bolts, and then a lot of just getting the language in you. And I have referred to this 80-20. You know, the big picture should be about 80%, and the picking at the nuts and bolts 20%. It's also sometimes referred to as, you know, top to bottom, which is the big picture, or bottom up, where you're starting with the bits and pieces and working your way up to the bigger picture. But in any case, here again, it's not a either this or either that. I think it's a bit of a mixture of both. I think because the grammar and, you know, nailing down the basics, which I don't think we can do, that this has been the dominant and remains to this day the dominant method of language instruction. It's good to point out, as Krashen does repeatedly, the tremendous power of meaningful, compelling input, and that in the end, the languages that we speak the best will be those where we've had the greatest amount of input and also where we have used them. But in order to be able to use them a lot, to have meaningful conversations, we need vocabulary, we need input. So to summarize then, I think to some extent, those debates is more a question of emphasis, and that emphasis will depend on our personal preference, but one should be open-minded to the fact that different people react differently based on these preferences, but that, let's call it the revolutionary value of Krashen's emphasis on input has been to move the sort of dialogue in language instruction further towards, in favor of input. And I think that has been a very valuable contribution, one that certainly reflects my views, and these were my views long before I discovered Stephen Krashen. These were my views as a language learner. So there you have it, a little bit about what I would call the false debates in language learning. Bye for now. And if you like my videos, please subscribe.